from the same group last year found that 15% of Americans, nearly 35 million adults, hold deeply anti-Semitic views, which is an increase of about 3% from the year before. So how big of an issue is this? How concerned should we be about anti-Semitic acts of violence like the ones we saw in France today? Phil Mudd is former Deputy Director of Counterterrorism for the CIA. Chad Sweet is former Department of Homeland Security Chief of Staff. Good to see both of you. Phil, let me start with you. How concerned are you about the rise of anti-Semitic incidents in this country?
I think we should be concerned for a few reasons. First of all, if you look at the divisiveness in Europe, this isn't just an isolated incident against a Jewish target or a military target. You're talking about social debates about immigration in Europe, immigration in France. That's part of the presidential debate. So this is a deeper issue than just one lone gunman shooting a few people. The second thing we have to remember, and I have to go back to sitting at the threat table at the FBI, is what the chief of NYPD talked about, and that is copycatters. We saw this in the anthrax case 10 years ago. Copycatters for years were sending fake anthrax letters because they got the inspiration from those attempts back in 2001. So I think there's both the underlying social issues here about foreign populations, about anti-Semitism, and there's all the prospect of copycatters.
Chad, what could be behind the rise in anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the U.S.?
Well, I think in the U.S., it's, as Phil just noted, a number of motivations. Some of them clearly focused on policies. Some of them focused on Israel. Some of them focused on just flat racism. But I think in this case, when you look at the French incident, let's bear in mind that the first three victims were all paramilitary soldiers in the French military and not Jewish. And so what's important to remember is that there is definitely the rabbi that was targeted along with the three children is anti-Semitic in that it is connected more with Israel and military targets. What we're seeing around the globe right now, as Phil knows, is we've seen a rash of attacks against Israeli diplomats, largely in the context of the tensions with Iran right now.
One thing, Phil, I'm curious about what sort of patterns you see, especially from the French gunman. I mean, we don't know anything about who this individual is, but obviously in that part of France and in France in general, there has been a lot of tension due to rising Muslim immigration into France. And again, we have no idea whether the gunman is Muslim and that this might be linked to Muslim-Jewish issues or not, but that is certainly an issue in France.
I think there's a couple things you have to think about, one of which we see in the United States, and that is opposition to French engagement or American engagement overseas. We saw this a couple years ago in Texas when we had an Army officer shoot up a military base because he was opposed to U.S. deployments overseas. Some of this, as Chad suggested, might be directed against French military deployments overseas. So not all this is isolated to Europe. Some of this has to be seen in the context of global opposition to sort of engagement in places like Iraq and Afghanistan.
Chad, final question to you, since we have seen an increase in these incidents. Is this more than a lone wolf sort of a situation? I mean, you mentioned involvement, whether it be Hezbollah or somebody else. I mean, is it possible something coordinated, or would that be absolutely impossible to tell?
Well, I think at this stage it requires further investigation, but there's clearly a signature here. If you look at the death of the first paramilitary French officer, he was not wearing uniform. He was there were no military indications on his motorcycle, which is a signature that there was pre-attack surveillance, and the other two were wearing uniforms. So I think you put that in the context, as Phil said, of the attacks on Israeli diplomats in India, in Georgia, and an attempt in Thailand, and what you have is a global picture that is exactly what Phil said, which is anti-Semitic targeting of Israeli Jews and American Jews in retaliation for things like the recent Afghan massacre, which was regrettable just a few days ago.
All right, Phil, Chad, thank you very much. Appreciate your perspective tonight. We have dramatic